I was born on the 11th of January 1934 in Stuttgart, Germany. Well, I've lived in Caulfield for the last 24 years. Before that, I lived in Murrumbeena for 37 years. So I've been around a day or two. I still speak German. I mean, I'm not totally, well, I'm reasonably fluent, but I miss words. But once I'm sort of speaking for a while, it all comes back. In fact, and we'll probably go into this a bit later, I've been back to Germany about 7 or 8 times in the last 30 years. And whenever I go back, I speak to school groups and community groups. And the first couple of days, there's quite a few words missing. But once I get into it, but the thing is that you never really forget language. And I'll give you another example that, of course, we lived in the Czech Republic from 1936 to 1947. And I was back there, I think it was in probably 87. And I went back to Theresienstadt, where I was interned for 3 years. And at that stage, still behind the Iron Curtain. And there's a museum there, and I organised to go there and take an interpreter. And the man in charge, who was I think he was a major, but the place was run at that time before by basically what was the equivalent of the Russian NKVD. Anyway, he showed us around and interpret. And about half an hour into the walk around, and suddenly, of course he was spoken Czech. I can understand what the fuck. So once you've got language, once you hear it again for a while, it comes back to you. So it's the same with German. I'm fairly fluent in German. Of course, writing is one of the. I'm not that fluent because I never went to school, German school. So yes, there's sort of German and of course English. I think I'm always willing to do new things. I mean, I'm involved in all sorts of non-paying activities. In fact, I've taken up something about almost 2 years ago now. I've sort of gone into not show business, but into sort of film extras and stuff like that. In fact, that all started rather oddly. There was on Facebook, it would have been 2 years ago in May. They're looking for extras for a television series, The Preacher, which I think is on Netflix. Anyway, so I think, and I got a call. Yes, you're interested, come in, have a fitting, then come to the thing. And after I did that, I was talking to a friend of mine who's been doing this for 30 odd years. And she said, look, well, you should sort of, follow this up. So there was another thing on Facebook of an agency. They're looking for people to sign up. So I talked to them and I got 2 things out of them already. And I've got another one definite in a week's time. There's another possible one. And unfortunately, I had one at the beginning of January, which I had to knock back, which was an extra in Jack Irish. But what happened, I had to take my wife to hospital that day, and obviously, so I had to ring them the night before, so sorry. So I've had a few, there's a couple, they keep sending out little things, are you available? Well, there's 2 I definitely was not available recently. One, they're looking for a newborn baby, which I don't think I fit. And the other one was they're doing a shoot in Bendigo for the Chinese involvement in the gold rush. And I don't really look Chinese, so that one wasn't on the cards. So now, look, I get involved in all sorts of new things. Look, I'm probably kidding myself, but it's probably nonsense. But why I get involved in some of this communal stuff, that somehow in the back of my mind, there's a very small number of Holocaust survivors. And I've always had this in the back of my mind, there must be a reason why I survived, others didn't. I mean, I've got some sort of obligation to put something back. I mean, I might be fantasizing, might be total nonsense, but I got involved 7 years ago. I'm a voluntary guide to the shrine. Well, we used to do it every week, but since COVID, at the moment we're only every second week, but we haven't got the crowd, so it's staggered. But that's my 7th year. I've been on school committees. I'm on the committee at U3A, and I run a course there. A few other things. So, well, that's sort of, I don't know. Look, I might be fantasizing, but that's my way of saying thank you. I'm still here. Well, I'm very much into histories and a bit of political sort of stuff. A bit of science fiction is a bit of it's a distraction, keeps in another dimension. But most probably local histories and that sort of stuff. Occasionally, when I sort of travel, I look at some destination information. Yes, Casablanca. Oh, look, it's a classic. It really is a classic. And that famous line of all the gin joints in the world you walk into, it had to be mine. And I've watched it dozens. In fact, quite often, and I've travelled reasonably extensively, when I'm on a long flight, I'll try and find Casablanca on the TV. Oh, good old, no, of course, we are Geelong. What sort of question is that? Actually, I'll tell you one quote that actually I've used in the book. I don't know whether you're probably too young, but there was a TV series back in the 60s, The Naked City. And it's all about a cop show in New York. Now, the show itself, but at the end of each show, there was a voiceover that there are 8 million people in the naked city. This has been one of them. And I think this really epitomizes the whole. In fact, I've been running short course at the University of Third Age. I think it must be about the 10th year in writing family history. And that is to me, is the essence of a course like that. Because everybody has a story. And not only that, but a lot of people come to the course say, oh, look, nothing happened. But what I tell them, that they might be interested in writing about themselves, their family history, but what they're doing, and I think this is very important, they're opening a window into a place, into a time, into a society. And I think that really is the kernel of these sort of things. I'll tell you one place I've been there, I'm always fascinated, is the Flinders Rangers. Have you ever been there? Well, look, Wilpena Pound is such a mystical place. It's actually, I believe it's a former meteor crater. I mean, it's huge. But when you're there at night, there's there is some lighting there, but the whole sky. I mean, it's really magical. And the other place I've been like that, not far away, on a houseboat up at Lake Eildon, where there's no street lights, no lights, and you've got on a clear night. I mean, that is really sort of almost. I'm a cynic, but they're almost mystical, those places. Well, look, I've always had this might sound very, very strange. I've always had this dream living out in the country on a hill facing a serene lake. I mean, it's probably total nonsense. I mean, the closest I've come to that, my son-in-law has got a holiday place up on Lake Yukonbin, and sitting on the veranda and looking at the lake in front of you, that's probably sort of a serene place. Friends, there's a lot of acquaintances, but friends you can sort of sit down, you can sort of share your dreams, your worries with, and it's reciprocal and then non-judgmental. It's something that perhaps you do that you shouldn't be doing. I think that really is the quality. And there's sort of friends that you might have had contact with many, many years ago, and you catch up after a long time. In fact, there was one friend, he died a few years ago. We hadn't seen each other for about 20 or 30 years. And when we sat down, and it's all just like no time had passed. within 5 minutes we're sort of back on familiar ground. So that is probably, look, I haven't got that many close friends, but I think it's something when people have mutual understanding of each other. That really, when you've got a lot of friends who sort of seek certain sort of benefits, but I think that is basically that people sort of not necessarily have to have the same line of thought, but you can appreciate each other's point of view. I think that really is the basis of real good friendship. Look, there's a couple. I mean, unfortunately, a couple of 2 or 3 of my friends for a long time, we're friends and we sort of drift apart. And by the time it's time to catch up, they'd actually died. So that, that's one of those, that's how life runs. In fact, it's interesting because there's a couple of friends that moved overseas, and we still keep contact. But when I was in Germany, I actually caught up with someone who lived there, and it was amazing because we almost, as I know, time there's 40 years in between, but although no time had elapsed. But that sort of thing is very rare because people they got other interests, they got other directions. So friendship is a very precious thing. That's it's very hard to define. You've got a connection, and it's one that over the years, all right, you do different things, and you do but at the end of the day, you still have the connection where you can actually share thoughts, ideas, the sort of thing. So once again, it's a nebulous concept, but you can't say, well, 0.1, 0.3, 0.4. Look, some of these things are very hard to define. Well, we still keep, sort of have common things. We have common ideas. I'm very involved in a number of organisations. So certain people in the organisation you have better connection with than others. I mean, this is one of the problems with organisations. A lot of them tend to be fairly cliquey. The sort of little groups form, and you're sort of either in or out. So there's a few friends we can share things. We go out together. A couple of friends we've travelled with. So once again, it's a sort of a mixed bag. There is no particular. There was a very, very good friend. We've been friends for about 50, probably 60 years. But they died about 2 or 3 years ago, and we're very close. We basically sort of, our kids sort of close. But once again, it's a lot of people are superficial. I mean, this might be cynical, but and somehow you you sort of edge away from people like that. Look, when I was young, I always had an ambition to become a vet. But quite frankly, I mean, with my schooling, I mean, because of the circumstance places, I went to school for sort of first grade, and then schools are banned for Jewish children. Then we in turn. Then I went back to school overseas a couple of years, and we came here. And I went to third year in secondary school, and then of course I went and got apprenticed. I mean, because I didn't have the sort of background to study. And then once again, late in life, in 1984, I enrolled in a BA degree off campus at Deakin. And having been bitten by the bug when I finished it, I did a master's at Monash. So, but basically, my early sort of ambitions obviously were not practical. I mean, there was no way when you only went to third year secondary school that you could do anything professional. So once again, I seem to be a late starter of things because of circumstances and that sort of thing. I don't know I'm probably quite happy with the way it turned out, because look, the thing is that, and what I've done, a lot of my friends sort of been rather envious about, because I mean, when when you're 18, you're not happy what you're doing, you rush out, and when you're a bit older, you get a little bit more circumspect. But the very fact that I've given things away, some through curves, others through choice, and went on something new. You know, some of my friends have been stuck in what I've been doing most of their life, are envious of, I wish we could do that, we haven't got the guts. I think that really, I think you need to reach forward. And unless, now of course, we all have bad days in our working life, but if you get up on Monday morning and say, God, not another week, I think it's time you did look for something else, because life is just too short. To stick in something, it really is. Life is too short to sort of be. I mean, as I said, when you're 18, you rush out the door. When you're sort of a bit older, you're a little bit more circumspect, and you look for something. And when you find something, well, this is when I went freelance. That I looked at the options. I mean, the house was paid for, the kids were sort of left home. We had a sort of reasonable thing. I thought, well, I'll try this. If it doesn't work, well, I've tried. When I was working for about 9 months after I left GEC, for a company, basically they sold plastic material, and actually I got the job because they also had printed circuit boards, and I was looking after them with the electrical background. And quite frankly, the management had absolutely no idea of how to sort of work for customers. That you went out and sold stuff, they never sort of kept up their supply, and in the end, I just walked out, because really, your liaison with your customer, really the basis relies on trust. And when you promise stuff, and your backup really sort of just doesn't sort of stand behind you. And quite frankly, that was the most frustrating time I've ever had. And after about 9 months, well, I was ready to walk out, and I really told the manager, what the hell he can do with, and he said, well, out you go. But I mean, I don't know whether he or I got in first, but that's not. But that was the most unhappy time, because you face customers, clients, and a lot of the clients, become friends in many ways. And when you really sort of, in fact, when I was working for GEC, it's just how you develop things. I used to call on electrical switchboard builders, also contractors. And there's one, fairly, well, they've gone out of business. They've sort of, for about 18 months, I went back and visit every month, and he would never ever sort of do business with us. And one day, he said to me, look, you're such a persistent bugger. I really, I think I really feel obliged to order something. And for the next 2 or 3 years, he was one very, very good customer. I used to take him to football, and so you develop but the basis behind it is, if you promise something to them, I mean, look, there's circumstances outside, but really you need to keep your word. And if you build that sort of trust, people will. I mean, I know these days in commerce, if you offer someone something $5 cheaper, they'll go. But there's a certain connection and really it's your integrity that and this is, I think, with a lot of probably unfair, but these a lot of tradies, when you sort of make a point that they don't turn up, there's very few you can really sort of deal with. It's one of those sort of, I don't know, I mean, these days there seems to be less and less. It's, you know, a lot of the small businesses are going out because, you know, the big lot gobble them up and you're just a number somewhere down the... So once again, there's a lot more than just selling a thing. It's, you know, I mean, when I was with GEC quite often, I looked after all the motor control and the fuse gear. That, I mean, that you might get a phone call at the weekend saying, look, we've run out of fuses, can you help us? I mean, that's the sort of thing it's part of the thing. And the other thing, before went to, for a short while after our own little business sort of closed, I worked for a German company in the safety equipment, a Draeger. And at the time, I remember there was a big mine explosion up in New South Wales, and we also we're an agent German company that manufactures these airbags that, you know, lifting. And I had sort of, when there's big mine disaster, they sort of, you know, they rang us. I was on the phone to Germany to get stuff out for them. But this is all part and parcel. That, you know, it's not just, oh, it's 5 o'clock, you know, the office is closed. And this, I think, is one of the problems these days. There's, you know, some of these service things become, you know, the world has changed. Maybe I've been left behind, but there's a certain amount of, there's more than just sort of selling a product. I mean, you establish a connection with the client, and quite often, well, they couldn't give a damn about you, but, you know, sometimes you have this sort of thing, or they'll ring you and say, look, I've had an offer from the rivals, what can you do about it? And then you sort of, and the other thing I used to do, I used to go around and give lectures on fuse gear and how, you know, to contractors. That was sort of another part of the service. And, you know, there was one of the rival companies used to sort of advertise that every fuse is pre-tested. Now, that was one of the most ridiculous statements, where if you pre-test the fuse, well, it's gone. You know, you pick up these little things as you go through life. Now, this is probably being totally egotistical, that when I'm gone from this world, hopefully someone will remember that I've contributed, maybe not much, but I've contributed something. Be it sort of helping someone, be it producing someone, but that's probably totally self-centered. Or perhaps, let me be more specific, that I didn't do anything really that created a serious problem. I think that is probably, I mean, if I put it together, that might be I did no harm to anybody. Well, it depends. That, I mean, most days these days well, let me go through the week. On Mondays I'm at U3A. I run a short course, but I'm also one of the people on the committee, and each committee member either opens in the morning or closes at night, so that's Mondays. On Tuesdays, I've been on Zoom attending a U3A course in the French Revolution, so in the evening I usually go to the Rotary meeting. Wednesdays is usually clear day. Thursdays, as I said, it was every week now, so before I go to the shrine. And Fridays, whatever comes up. Also, once a month on a Thursday, I've got a little stint on the community radio, talk about films and travel. And on Saturday I go to synagogue, not because so much of a religious thing, but I happen to be on the security team. And that, I mean, this day and age is a very important thing. We like to go out for meals. Friday nights you spend with the family, so that's sort of the week. Travelling overseas, which of course the last 18 months hasn't been an option, and I don't think it'll be an option for the next 18 months. But no, look, probably the perfect day is probably travel or spend sort of interesting, sort of got interesting sort of things to see. Once again, it depends where I am, who I'm with. So look, it's not a rigid schedule. Well, I suppose surviving the war. I mean, where I was was not an extermination camp. Basically, it was a holding camp. And over the 4 years, about 140,000 people went through, plus 15,000 kids under 14 went through. At the end of the war, now the figures are a little bit vague, but some figures say 120, some figures say 140 were still alive. So that really was, I mean, on the 5th of May, 1945, when 3 Russian tanks rolled into the camp. I mean, that really was, in many ways, my birthday, because that I think probably was, the day that really is a very sort of significant milestone for obvious reasons. That you need to sort of take people as they come. You shouldn't make judgments of people if you don't know their background, their history, and why they're doing certain things. And I think at the end of the day, you should not, I mean, you'll dislike people, but you should not really hate people, because hate, in many ways, is far more toxic to you than the person you hate. I think that really is sort of, you've got to take people as you find them. And you should never make, I mean, we all do, but you should never make assumptions about why people do things, because you don't know the background, you don't know what their motivation is. So I think really, even more basic, that if you're in an argument, you should always put yourself in the other person's position and try and analyze why they're like that, why they're sort of putting this out, and why they're doing things that do. I mean, I'm not talking about some of these street gangs that go around, bashing people up. I mean, that's just outside the normal. But with average people, I think you should be understanding that you're not perfect, and neither are they, and you should listen to them rather than talk. I mean, look, it's a nebulous concept. I don't know. You have to ask other people about that. What I'm impressed with, or they're impressed with. Mind you, I've had a bit of sort of adoration, if you like, when I was a couple of months ago on a hot seat, and I won a bit of money. But look, the fascinating thing, that was fine. But the aftermath, and I really cannot explain it. I mean, I'm still sort of staggered by it. That about 7 years ago, earlier, but I had 2 editions of my memoirs, and it was published by a community library down in Hawthorne Road. And I was on the show on a Tuesday night, the beginning of March. The next morning, the lady in charge of Lamb Library rings me and said, "Oh, have you got any of the books left?" I said, "Oh, I don't know, I might have half a dozen somewhere." She said, "Well, overnight I had 64 paid orders for the book." I said, "You had what?" So they had to run a reprint. I mean, that really, I still can't come to grips with it. And the other thing was, look, don't ask me to explain the background of it. Also, Eddie Maguire sort of talks to. Actually, I'll tell you what. Eddie is a very nice guy, and what happened to him in Collingwood, I think, was a little bit unfair to him. But But anyway, he held up the book and he talked about it, but also, I sort of mentioned Rotary, and that this year is the 100th anniversary of Rotary starting in Australia, and I don't know where to pick. I had something like 150 comments on Facebook, some from South Africa, obviously for the Rotary Network, from Sweden, it was just staggering. I mean, it really, I really couldn't understand how it all happened. So in some ways, that probably was well, once again, probably stroking egos, but that was a really unbelievable sort of thing that happened. I really couldn't explain how and why. Oh, I think probably the kids arriving, the kids growing up, the grandkids arriving, the grandkids sort of doing well. That's probably that's sort of. I mean, family is a very big sort of item in our lives, particularly as a lot of the grandparents and that sort of all died in the Holocaust. So it's in many ways that's the sort of anchor point of family. That really is, but that's the priority. How the kids are doing well, what they're doing. Living in the Czech Republic, roast duck is my favourite. And when you smell roast duck, that really sort of tickles the fancy. In fact, and the other one is when we're in America, there's a place in San Diego, a steak place, on top of the hill. They've got a very, very interesting place that they will not allow ties. If anyone walks in with a tie, they cut it off and hang on. But the steak there, we were there must be 35 years ago. I can still taste that steak. The best steak I've ever had. So that's the two possible. And I don't mind the smell of good coffee. Yeah, I can tell you that, and going back, we left Germany in 1936. We went to the Czech Republic, but where did we go? I don't know how much you're aware of the geography. We went what is called the Sudetenland, which was which Germany annexed in 1938. Well, I remember my father came home. I was 4. We were sitting down to dinner or lunch. My father rushed in and said, we're leaving. The Germans will be marching in 4 hours. And, I mean, to a kid of 4, leaving lunch uneaten is far more vital than anything happens in the world. So that really is my first memory of, and as I put in my book, that it's a bit like sitting in the sun with your eyes closed and feeling the warmth of the sun, and suddenly a dark cloud comes over, you feel the cold. That's what I analyse that particular moment. That probably is. And the other one, down the track, then we moved to Prague. In March 1939, the Germans marched into Prague, and I can remember standing in the street, seeing all the German tanks and trucks coming in, and somehow, and that's still with me, sort of I could feel the embodiment of evil in front of me that was to come. I cannot tell how it was, but these are probably the 2 earliest memories, a very, very strong impact on me. Well, I don't know when I was a kid, it's not for me to change the past. But look, probably, and this is totally out of anybody's control, perhaps if my family had have gone, not that that was really possible because of the circumstance, had have sort of moved away from Europe, but quite frankly, that wasn't possible because most countries closed their doors anyway. But that probably would be, of course, and the other thing that happened, which made probably a huge impact, that after the war, one sort of wrote to relatives. We had 2 of my uncles came to Australia just before the war, and my cousin on my mother's side lived in Brazil. So, letters were written, we're still around, and eventually we got a permit for Australia on a Monday. On the following Friday, a visa from Brazil arrived. Now, if that had been the other way around, we probably would have been in Brazil, and if I had met you, I probably would be talking to you in Portuguese. And also considering the troubles they got with the virus in Brazil, this probably was not a good place to go anyway. So that perhaps, it's something I would have never had any control over, but that probably, that would have totally changed the course of my life. That, I mean, I would have grown up in a different environment. I may have gone to uni, sort of as a look. I don't know. It's how can you tell? I think the biggest regret, which in some way have caught up, that I would have liked to go to tertiary studies, which obviously wasn't practical. But as I said, some 30, 40 years later, I did that. So, look, I don't know, look, there's no point having regrets because you cannot change the past. Well, look, I don't know, perhaps, I don't know whether I should be saying that, a couple of sort of girlfriends I had, maybe would have, I'm very happy we've been married for 61 years, quite happily, but, sometimes you wonder if so-and-so, I don't know, look, how can you tell? If I could tell my youngest, possibly that I would take a more, probably not as relaxed approach to life, be more concentrated on certain things. I mean, we've got a reasonable comfort of life. I mean, we're not overflowing with material possessions, but that's never been, look, as long as you basically, if you've got 3 meals a day, you've got a roof over your head, you can afford to do a bit of travelling, you can afford to go out, do things. But some of these people, the ultra-rich, who amass money for the sake of money, a lot of them are very unhappy. So look, I don't think I'll change that much. I mean, maybe, probably, be a little bit more sort of adventurous and things too. But no, look, I'm really quite content where I am and where I'm going. Well, there was one about a year ago. I mean, it's 2 years ago. We're looking after my daughter and son-in-law's dog and he's staying with us. And in the morning we let him out. We're in our pajamas. I went out to get the paper, and the door slammed. And here we were, 2 of us with the dog outside on the footpath. We didn't have a key, we didn't have a phone to ring my daughter, but fortunately our neighbour, she let us use their phone, and we rang the RAC. We've got our the domestic cover, and the locksmith came. But that was probably most of it. Here we were in our pyjamas, dressing out the street with the dog. And it was a cold morning, so that probably was the most embarrassing. And the most sort of, the other experience, which wasn't embarrassing, was just weird. 3 years ago, I was overseas with my daughter and my grandson. And we flew back from Europe via Amsterdam. And we had to change plans at Amsterdam, went to Schiphol Airport. My daughter and I were in one line going into the airport, and my grandson was in the next line. Now, we were sort of frisks, our bags were unpacked, and they asked all sorts of awkward questions. My grandson, 21 with a backpack, with the next lane, just waved him through and didn't look in his backpack. That was the most weirdest experience. And my daughter looked at me, and I looked at my daughter, and we said, what the hell's going on? Do we look like drug runners? I don't know. I don't really have any bad habits. I don't smoke. I sort of drink occasionally. Look, I think probably a bad habit. I don't know if it's a bad habit, but with my German background, everything has got to be in the right place. I've got to have a sort of an order in my life. In fact, over the last 18 months with COVID, when I couldn't go there, that really sort of upset me. Now I'm back in routine that, I've got to do 3 hours, go to this right. I think that's probably, and it's probably my sort of my background, that things have got to be in order. I've got to have a logical sequence of doing things. Look, probably taking up tertiary studies. But then again, that wasn't an option because I was making a living. I was doing how all that started. In fact, I started a course at CAE. Now, and this was one of those strange things that they used Deakin University material, but the rule was you shouldn't have any contact with Deakin. That wasn't on. And when I was working in the electrical business, I used to travel to Geelong to see customers, and then one day I decided, well, to hell with this. I'll go and see one of the lecturers at Deakin, which I wasn't supposed to do. And I sat down with her and we had a long chat. And she said, look, how are you doing it? You should really enroll in a proper course here, even if it's off campus. And perhaps if I had done it years earlier, I might have, I don't know. But as I said, I'm a non-conformist. When people say you can't do something, that's when I get get quite stubborn. So that's probably one of the things that, I mean, whether that would have been practical time and commitment-wise, but that's probably one thing that I should have done. But I didn't, so there's no point agonising about it. So I know. Go dancing on the stars. I haven't tried it, but I don't think that's my thing. I think making mistakes, unless they're sort of desperate, really is a learning curve. That it sort of tells you what you're probably good at and what you're not good at. But I think, look, mistakes, unless they're sort of really bad, it's not really a handicap. I mean, it gives you a lead saying, well, you've done that, but you didn't quite get there. You should improve that, you should do better, perhaps be more concentrated or look at it or see what others do. But look, I don't think maybe I'm being simplistic, but I don't think there's any sort of major, probably sort of always hoping every year, it happens 3 times, that Geelong actually wins a flag. Actually, my younger daughter, she was born in '63, she's a keen Collingwood supporter. And for years, Vicky asked me, think that I'll live long enough to ever see Geelong win a flag? Well, 2007, it came good. No, look, I don't like looking back. I mean, look, it's out there. So, look, you make mistakes, but unless they're really, sort of very damaging, you learn from them. I mean, it's no point brooding about what might have been because you can't fix it. You just think, well, maybe I should do this differently. I should do something in a different way. Oh, that's easy. Nigella Lawson. And probably Bill Clinton. Basically people who sort of think they're superior to everybody else, and then they know everything and think they know everything, and that they really want to sort of rule the roost. In fact, there's one friend, who in the organisation, he likes to sort of play kingpin, but he will not take a position where he's got to do things. And that is sort of people that really, really irritate me. That if you want to do things, roll up your sleeves, get involved. The people who sit back and criticise and sort of want to rule the roost, they really piss me off, to put it very bluntly. I think, just consider, see others as you see yourself. Basically, I mean, look, the world is full of strife, but with a little bit of common sense and a little bit of adjustment between people, I think that really is, don't just think of the straight and narrow. Think of all the things that that basically people you would think that people are sort of reasonable, most people, and that really that you may disagree with them, but you got to take their point of view. I mean, I think it was Voltaire who said, "I totally disagree with this person's views, but I will fight to the death for him to be able to express them." I think that is really. And the other thing, I don't know if you ever read any of Sartre's stuff. Well, there's one about, I think it's set, basically, the background is, I think, the French-Algerian War. And there's a very interesting opening paragraph that two men sit in a dungeon. One only sees the dirt and the misery. The other one looks and sees the stars. I think that really is sort of the human condition. Now, some people only see the bad things. Others, even in bad situations, can see a little bit of hope, a little bit of light. I belong to an organisation, and we've got, in fact, I've got a meeting tonight. Every year we give an award. It's called the Menorah Award because our motto is a menorah, seven-wax candle, of people who, the sort of quiet achievers who work tirelessly for decades in the community and never ever get acknowledged. And I think amongst those, in fact, I said we've got a meeting for this year's selection tonight. I think it's those people, the quiet people who work behind the scenes, they serve on committees, they do things, and they're never acknowledged. I mean, a lot of the big stars get their OBMs and AMs, but it's those quiet people that do things without ever claiming sort of credit for it. The ones that sort of, the SES people, in fact, the Mint at the moment is issuing a set of, I think, 12 coins of the thank you coins, the fireys, the community workers. It's those people who put in decades of their lives without ever claiming any credit. I think they're the ones that I admire, without sort of looking for rewards. And they're really, some more others, that volunteers in this community put in something like $4 billion worth of value of things that they're associated with. And I think they're the people that really, I think they're the ones we need to admire, not the ones that blow the big trumpet and beat their chests and aren't they wonderful. We used to, well, not at the moment, we used to go on a lot of cruises. And we've been around Europe, I'll tell you one probably that stands in my about, must be 6-7 years ago, we went on a cruise from Melbourne to South Africa. And that, in many ways, I think because South Africa is such a contrast that the sort of, on the surface, as I said, I like Cape Town, but I could not live there. All the barbed fences, and if you want to go on the shop, you've got to press the bell to unlock the gate. And also the people that you meet on these cruises. In fact, the one we sort of went from here to South Africa, actually that cruise was a round the world cruise. We had that, they went from Liverpool for 104 days around the world. And we sat at dinner with an Indian couple who actually grew up in England. And look, it was a very, very strange man. He totally hated the Indians. And in fact, there's another English couple at the table with us, and they just kept looking at us and saying, "What's with this guy?" But look, you'd meet different people. You see some of the European travels. And the other thing, when we went back to Germany, particularly the first time, that in many ways, after the war, I had absolutely no truck with Germany but over the years, you sort of develop contact. And I'll tell you one very interesting one I did, when we went back to Stuttgart, back the first time, well, been there, but the real trip was 2001, when what I call the German guilt trip, when they invited former Jewish citizens to the recompense. Now, in fact, there's a bit of a background that Berlin did it from the 1950s. Now, in about 88, I wrote to Stuttgart, where I came from, and saying, well, Berlin's been doing it, what are you doing about it? And I got a very polite letter back saying, we gave a large donation of, say, to Israel, and that's our lot now. Now, piss off. Well, they didn't say the last, but... And then a year later, I got another letter saying, we have this going. If you're interested, register. And then it took 19 years for it to happen. But anyway, who all was the driving force was the then Lord Mayor of Stuttgart, which was Manfred Rommel, which was Irving Rommel's son. And I had some very interesting... I went on a couple of occasions back there talking to him. He died. In fact, that was very interesting. When he died, there was a big obituary in the Melbourne Age for him, which I don't know where it came from. Anyway, I had some very interesting discussions with Rommels, and he was telling me that his father, the Field Marshal, had a great admiration for the Australian troops, particularly around Tobruk. And that was very, very interesting. And I met quite a few other sort of people there. And that, and the interesting part, we met a lot of people who are really, well, that's the other thing, that over the years I found that the younger generation said, look, let's draw a line, they're still putting up monuments and stuff, but there's certainly a group of people who really sort of still try and remedy things, but under the right-wing gaining now, these things sort of get watered down. And that is why it's so important to go and talk to schools and people over there. In fact, every time I've done this, kids have come up to me and said, we learn about this in school, but to meet someone actually was there makes it all come alive. So it's a very important, we won't be around forever, and that really is something we have a sort of duty to do. I grew up in different places. I mean, I was born in Stuttgart. Our family left when I was 2. We went to Sudetenland, and when I was 4, we moved on. We lived in Terezin for 3 years. I lived in the Czech Republic from 45 to 47, and then I came here. So I grew up in different places and different sort of background, different languages. If I was in a country where I didn't speak the language or couldn't understand, I mean, that probably would really throw me. Because, in fact, I remember a little episode, not mine, but we were in 2 places. One, when I was going to Germany, we had to change, flying to Frankfurt, then you fly where we're going. And a couple of Australian girls came up there totally distressed because there's very little signage. All the signage is in German. They didn't know which sort of gate lounge they had to get to. And that was one, and I happily directed them. And the other one was really even funnier. We went to a conducted tour in Prague, and we went when we got to near the end of the tour in the town square, the guide sort of said, "Oh, goodbye," and off she went. And a couple of Aussies said, "How do we get back to the hotel?" I mean, and the other fascinating one was we're in Hong Kong. We went on a tram or a bus up to the peak. Anyway, there was a couple there. I don't know where they're from. I think they might have been in anyway. And the guide really didn't. So they asked And now they were Germans, that's right, an old elderly couple, they couldn't understand. So they asked us in German, I asked the guide in English, and then I translated back, or the bus driver, and that was another fascinating sort of, when you talk about strange things in language, that really sort of tickled my fancy. I'd organised, when I went back at one time in Germany, and I was sort of very involved with motoring then, and I organised Mercedes here that I wanted to sort of visit to the Mercedes plant in Stuttgart. So they organised all that, it was very nice, I spent a day there, they showed me around, they shouted me lunch, but certain days I didn't speak German, and they all speak English there. Anyway, come to the end of the day, as I was leaving, I turned round and said to them in German, gentlemen, it was most very, very informative, and thank you for your hospitality. Now, I could see their mouth dropped open, their minds was, now what on earth were we talking about him? It wasn't supposed to hear. I mean, it's so little funny things, but how language plays a big part. And the other experience was also, when I went over there at one trip, oh, that's right, started off that a lot of the A-list journos and the motorists try to get over this overseas junkets. Well, the B list doesn't get those. So I was talking to Mercedes and BMW, who I was quite friendly with. I said, well, would you be interested in sponsor, send me up? They said, oh, look, we'd love to, but we haven't got the budget. And anyway, and also I was doing some travel stuff, so I got on the German Tourist Commission in Sydney and said, look, this is what I'm doing. Is there any sort of things you might get involved in? Also I contacted Lufthansa, and I got a very nice letter in German sort of thoroughness. We'd be interested, but our budgets are very tight. We come back next year. And I'm one of those persistent buggers. So I got back next year, and I got a reply saying, well, look, we can probably offer you a half fare. Fine. So I went back to the two car companies, and I said, would you be interested in the quarter fare? They said, yeah, we can handle that. Then I got in the German Tourist Commission in Sydney and said, what can you do? And he said, well, I'll have to refer this to Frankfurt. And this went on for a while. Anyway, I kept contact with the guy, I rang him. And then he came back to me and said, look, I gave him a suggested itinerary, and I was going to stay 4 days in Berlin and then go to Stuttgart. Anyway, he said, oh, look, we can offer you a half-day sponsored tour and 3 nights accommodation. I said, that's fine. And then I saw, this is all in English. And then I switched German, and I said, well, you realize, of course, if it's 3 days, the 4th day, and this is a real German expression, and I'll sort of listen, I'll have to sleep by Mother Green, which means out on the lawn. And there was a deathly silence. I must have been at least for 30 seconds. And he came and said, oh, you speak German? Yes. And after that, he couldn't do enough for me. And when I got to Berlin, he'd organised this half-day tour for me with a guide and a chauffeur. And they picked me up at the hotel receptions, and sort of had a very strange look on their face, and greeted me in English. And then the guide said, oh, I believe you speak German. They told me at the desk. And I'll tell you what, the whole approach was totally different. It's interesting how you play little tricks with language. It's very handy to be bilingual in these sort of cases. Probably Prague, because look, it's such a fascinating city. And I've been back a couple of times, but it's got a 1,000-year history. Each building always sort of exudes history. And I go back to Stuttgart. I've been back 5 or 6 times in the last 30 odd years. In some ways, I was only 2 when I left, but you've got a connection with the place you're born at. And also I've got a number of friends there now, which all adds to the thing. I haven't done anything outstanding, but I've sort of achieved most things that I've aimed at. Some you have. I think really that I've still got the ability to get interested in new things and pick up new things and fit in different environments. I've created and am part of a close family that understands each other. And a lot of families are totally dysfunctional. But we can sit down, we can sort of discuss things, we can disagree, but yet we're still close. And sort of, I've got 2 daughters, I've got 5 grandkids, and we're all on very, very close terms. I mean, some probably, no, look, you can't pick up favourite grandchildren, they're all, but particularly one, my grandson. I think we have, probably because we sort of travel overseas together, that might have, I don't know, I mean, and also, I mean, he's got a very sort of sense of humour, young Seamus, and actually he's now lives in Canberra. And look, I mean, they're all different, but now we get on very well. I mean, we can fairly close. I think is the achievement. And also having created a family, considering that a lot of our family perish. Look, I think that really, I mean, it's a question of continuity. And when I was in Germany, this was sort of television station made a documentary, and I think the very last sort of quote I gave him, he said, "Well, how do you feel what happened?" I said, "Well, I think I've won. I'm still here." Look, it's probably very fundamental, but that really is considering, what passed and what happened to, millions of people. I don't know. It's very hard, but I mean, I've never wanted to sort of had the ambition to win a Nobel Prize or anything like that. I mean, I think it's fairly simplistic. I think creating a continuity in the fact, I think considering what has happened, I think that is an achievement that I'm quite sort of proud of. No, not really. I mean, at the end, look, as long as I pay my bills, as long as I sort of don't wake up in the morning and I haven't paid a bill. Look, I've never had this great ambition for empire. Friends I have, lifestyle I have. We're not extravagant people. Look, I think that each sort of, I wake up in the mornings. In fact, a friend of mine has this great saying, if you wake up in the morning, you're above the law and not underneath, you're okay. I think that's, I mean, look, as long as you've got reasonable health and not particularly terrible worries, that really is, particularly when you get a certain age. I mean, you're not going to conquer the world from now, but I think that really is where you sort of come from. Oh, this morning when I got up, probably for family photos. Oh, no, it's a USB with the photos on it. Probably be a better writer. I mean, I'm doing reasonably, but compared to others, I'm not. But that probably is one of the things that I can tell stories better than I do now. How do people develop these prejudices that lead to hate and destruction? That really, what is their motivation? Why, pick on certain, I mean, and why are we persisting with some of these nonsensical sort of judgments of people? I mean, if you look around the world, all these sort of different, I mean, you go to the prejudices, and I know now at the moment the whole thing's blown out with position of women, but why are people sort of, what drives people to, I think in most cases it's ignorance, because they don't know. Well, I remember when I was an apprentice and we're on a building site, and I was talking to one of the other traders. I don't know how he came out and says, "I don't like Jews." And I said, "Why, have you ever met one?" "No, I've never met one." And I said, "Well, I'm Jewish, And he said, "Oh, but you're different." I mean, that was one of the ironies. I mean, in a way, it was sort of a joke, but the joke is that there were 80 million Jews in Germany. I mean, there weren't, but yeah, why were 80 million Jews? Well, every German had his pet Jew. We hate, but we don't mind you. You're okay. And the other joke was also that come out of Germany. The two lots of people who cause all the trouble in the world are the Jews and the bicycle riders. And the question, why the bicycle riders? And the question, why the Jews? I mean, that's the sort of concept. And now, look, this is one of the things that humour, even in the darkest situations, really is a very strong sort of almost a milepost that people in the darkest position. And this is the thing that when I run the Writing Family History course, that no matter how dire and dark the story is, there's always a light moment, and it's important to bring that out because people don't want to continually read about tragedy. There's got to be a little bit of light in the shade. So that's it's one of those things that that's part of the human conditions. And some of these public figures who never ever can see the funny side of themselves, I mean, I'm sorry for them. I mean, if you take yourself too seriously, one day it's all going to fall in a heap. To do something I like and also do something useful that might sort of be useful to others, be it family, be it friends, be it... I mean, doing the thing at the shrine. Look, in many ways, I mean, sure, it's great to meet people, but what really I think is the important part, that we get something like 80,000 school kids through a year. And the fact that you can transmit sort of a bit of history to the younger generation. The thing is that, and also I'm involved in a program called Courage to Care. We do incursions to both country and metropolitan schools, and basically it's anti-bullying, that sort of program. What we always tell the kids, and I do at the shrine, when you go home, for those who didn't come with you today, tell them what you've seen, what you've learned. I think that really is, you can transmit something about the past, about what happened. And I always make the point when I start off with a school group that the shrine is not a memorial to war. I mean, that I think is very important. It is a acknowledgement of those who served, how the sacrifice. I think it's a very important, and I mean, in Canberra it's called a War Memorial. The shrine here is the Shrine of Remembrance. I think it's one of the, I mean, it might seem petty, but I think it's important to implant, the purpose of things, and how it relates, what happened. In fact, you get some very odd questions. One is, I had about last year, this kid said, well, when will World War III start? I said, hopefully never. And the other thing is that a lot of the tours of about year 9, and we get the younger ones year 5 and 6, the 5 and 6 are always a challenge. They asked all the awkward questions. But look, it's the connection. And I think that really, I feel that is something I contribute to. And the Courage to Care one, which we're coming up 30 years next year, what we do, in fact, we've got an exhibition coming up in Chuka. We go up there a couple of weeks. We get a lot of school groups from all over the district. There's survivors, and they see a film. A survivor gives their story. Then we have a sort of little circle, sort of question answer thing. And I mean, the Holocaust was the wallpaper. But what it does do, it says, look, the basic message of Courage to Care is be don't be a bystander. Oh, now there's 4 people in the world. There's a perpetrator, there's a victim, there's a bystander, and there's an upstander. Now, obviously, we know what the perpetrator and the connection. The bystander is someone who sees things but turns up and no, look, this is not my thing. The upstander will not necessarily get involved physically, but they might tell someone about it, they might give some information. I think that don't turn your back when you see something that you think is not right. I mean, that, once again, in fact, I mean, Courage to Care gets a reasonable, not a fortune. It's been getting a subsidy from Department of Education for years. And that it's, I think, passing on things in a positive way. I think that really is something that I personally feel, a lot of people, that's something that we're achieving. It's handing something on. Of course, there was the famous tale going back 2,000 years when the Romans were in Palestine, Israel. A Roman sort of soldier saw an 80-year-old man plant an olive tree. And he went up to him, it's on the sagas, saying, "Why do you plant an olive tree, old man? Because it'll take 40 years to mature. I mean, you won't long on." And he said, "It's very, very simple, because I'm now using the olives that my grandfather planted." I think it's that continuity concept. Look, you worry about everyday problems and what's going to be the future. How will I cope in the future? When you get to a certain age, you've been there and you know, well, look, it's always worked out. There's nothing we can, outside info, we can't change. And possibly you try and communicate with younger generations saying, look, I've made this mistake. Perhaps if you do certain things, look at it from a different angle. Moving from one society, from one continent to a totally alien one. I mean, coming to Australia. In fact, I remember talking to some people who came here before the war from Germany, and they were saying when they told their family they're going to Australia, the father took a globe and sort of put a pencil through it, says, "See, when you put a hole here and you slide down to the bottom through the hole, that's where you finish up in Australia." Look, it's a totally different society. It's a totally different... in some ways, probably was easier for those who came after the war, because we left behind something that no longer, at that stage, had any attraction or any connection with us. And basically, it was a clean sheet. I think doing things that you really can't see any benefit in. That there's so many petty things in life that you really... I mean, a lot of people who sort of get involved in these little spats and useless things, and sort of mixing with people you've got nothing in common with, you're totally irrelevant to your... I mean, you learn from other people, but people who have absolutely no concept of what's important in life. That full of petty. Oh yes, look, so and so's got a better car than me. Why? Their house is smarter. They go on bigger. I mean, that sort of thing. That doesn't do anything for me. I mean, everybody's got to find their own way, their own particular sort of direction, what they feel is relevant. The relationship was very good, but one of the things possibly that might be of interest, that when I started writing my book, I sort of sat down with them, want to know about early days, and almost like hitting a brick wall, said, "No, look, we don't want to talk about this as in the past." But I think, look, a lot of Holocaust survivors had this hang-up. And I'll tell you, I've found that I've worked with Vietnam veterans, a lot of them have the same thing, they just, draw a curtain. But, my father died in 59, and then later on she remarried. And, Her second husband, right, but we didn't really have much in common. He was a bit of an oddball, but and then he died some years ago. Of course, my mother was about 4 or 5 years after the second husband died, and she lived round the corner from us. And we in Murrumbina, she was in East Bentley, and for a long time we wanted to sort of move, but while she was alive, that would have been World War III if we had moved away. So I moved that. But no, I mean, I think our relation is quite normal, I suppose. When you haven't got another mother to compare, how do you sort of establish these things? The thing was that, he died when I was 26. And look, in many ways, we didn't really, I was in business with him, but in many ways, there was never enough time to sort of talk about his earlier life, his sort of, he was World War One. He's put up his age and volunteers for the German army. And then he was, I think from 1917 to 1990, he was a prisoner of war in France. But we never really sort of, got to talk about, because, life had to build up another business. But it wasn't a bad relationship, but in some ways, looking back, probably we could have sort of had more in common. But, but I think this is one of the things. When migrant families come to a new country, they've got to establish themselves. They've got to, day-to-day priorities have really more sort of consequence than some of the going back and about their sort of past and family. Very little, because on my father's side, who lived in Berlin, my grandfather died when I was about 18 months. And of course we didn't live in Berlin, so I really had very little contact. With my mother's side, we were together in Czech Republic, then in Prague, but they were deported in early 42. Obviously, there was, when you're 7 or 8 years old and it's sort of in a different place, it's not a usual setting. So it's a different really family. So possibly, if there had been normal life, it would have been a flow-on. But the fascinating thing is that the older I get, the more I look like my maternal grandfather. In fact, I got some couple of photos side by side. So, and very likely one of my grandsons who looks like me will eventually look like my. But now look, you've got to understand that we didn't live in normal circumstances, normal times. So it's a totally different scenarios that really you can't really translate into a normal settled society. Well, our family is not that big. Obviously now it is. I've got 2 daughters, I've got 5 grandchildren, I've got 2 grandsons. So, but now we're a very close family. In fact, it's interesting, when my other son-in-law came on the scene, his family history is very disrupted. His father was an alcoholic. His mother, when he was fairly young, disappeared. Eventually 30 years later, they caught up with her. She learned to live in New Zealand. But when Kim came on the scene, he couldn't quite work us out, because we're sort of in his middle-class family, if you like. We're very close. And I think I mentioned this last time, that I was very much involved on the board of the MEAA, which was the Australian Journalists Association, and one of our industrial officer sat on some committee with Kim. And apparently one day Kim said to Louise, I'm keeping company with Garry Fabian, and she said, is he all related to Garry? And she said, it's her father. Oh, he's okay, he's one of us. So that's the sort of, how, and the other son-in-law, we've been friends with his parents forever and a day. And when my daughter started going out with him, we said, "Oh, what's his name? Danny. Danny who? I don't know." And then it turned out that, so it's totally different backgrounds. It was sort of quite, depend. I mean, once we got here, I was 13. I sort of was, fitted in. I went to school for 2 years. I had ambitions to be a vet, but that obviously wasn't on the cards. And I took up an apprenticeship. I did a trade, and then eventually I went in a business with my father. And then when we sort of closed that one, as I worked in various parts of the industry. So that, but look, in many ways, I suppose. I mean, at school I was fairly involved with running, and actually I probably would have got a lot further. But the year that I was in a number of competitions was the year in the early 50s. It was when the polio epidemic sort of hit and everything was closed. So, and once I started working, obviously, it wasn't really sort of that much time to get involved with training, that sort of stuff. Look, we're very close. And, we can argue about things, but it's never, there's no anything bad about it. And, as I said, we're very close. We sort of, we see each other a lot of the times. The grandchildren ring up, so can we go out for coffee, that type of thing. And they come around, and I think that's just one of the things. We're a very close family that, although we have different interests, and one of the, that's probably not right, but we tend to be very dysfunctional when it comes to following football teams. That my wife was a mild Collingwood supporter because she went to Dandenong High School. And in those days I had zones, and that was in Collingwood zone, and some of the players used to come out. My son-in-law and one granddaughter died in the Wool Hawthorn supporters. 2 grandsons are Carlton supporters. The other part of the family, they're Bulldogs supporters. So we have sometimes my son-in-law, the Hawthorn supporter, is very involved, and he gets very het up. So when either Geelong and Hawthorn play, or Hawthorn Bulldogs, there's always a bit of tension in the house. Oh, there's many. Well, I'll give you one. We're up in the Dandenongs on holidays, and one grandson, he was 6 at the time, was staying at a resort, and the handyman was working on the pool, and Jeremy wandered over and stood there looking, and the man said, "Oh, you're here to help?" He says, "No, I'm here to supervise." Oh, probably when, my father died, my mother died, and my, some of the family members died, that sort of gets to you. I mean, it's inevitable. Well, I think what is really relevant is where we came from. I mean, we've got, we go back in, as I said, in Europe, we've got, sketchy records back to the 1600s. And, in fact, in my maternal grandfather, my father's father, that family lived in a small town in East Prussia, which is now part of Poland. And I've got a copy of it. The Town Chronicle in 1602 recorded that Garry Fabian, because of some service to the gentry, was about to buy land, which is most unheard of in those days. And on my mother's side, I haven't got any records, but an uncle of hers before the war did some tracing, and he found them going back to about 1290 in round about Mannheim, Heidelberg. Well, I haven't got any records of it. And that's sort of, in some ways, it's not a earthship, but it records sort of, the continuity of the family. I don't think it's all similar, because you must understand, my parents sort of were basically a European family. And I mean, I really grew up in Australia in many ways. So the whole concept of seeing things, I mean, if you look at society, how things have changed. I mean, you're too young to remember, but back in the 50s, on a Sunday morning, no trains or trams, and it was church time. I mean, you project it into the days and people just look at you. So probably, I mean, their life, although of course after the 1930s, their normal life was totally disrupted and shattered, but in many ways, you know, they grew up in a different culture, a different continent, in a different sort of setting. I think really tolerance of other people's views, that, you know, that people are different, but yeah, you need to understand where they came from. That, and particularly when you grow up in a multicultural society, I think that was the sort of, yeah, when you promise to do something, yeah, you got to follow through. I mean, when you make an appointment, you keep it. I mean, I think that's probably what my father mainly taught me, that, you know, punctuality is the necessity of businessmen and the courtesy of kings, I think is the saying, isn't it? They're sort of two completely separate chapters. I mean, when I was 6, there was a year of school. This was in Prague after it was occupied, and the Jewish community ran a school. And at the end of the year, the Germans decided no school for it. And then I didn't go to school till I was 11 and a half after the end of the war. I went to school for 2 years in the Czech Republic, and then we came out here, of course. And then I went to school. I spent 6 months at... initially I went for just a few weeks to school, which is St Kilda Primary in Brighton Road, but then we moved to Thornbury, and I went for 8 weeks, I think it was 3 months, to Wales Street State School, and then the next year I went to Preston Tech, which is out, I don't know who it belongs to, in Preston, and the next year I went to Caulfield Tech, and then that was it, and then I did my apprenticeship. So, look, I didn't have a bad experience, but it sort of, I got a little bit of trouble, I think it was in Thornbury, when, no, it was at Caulfield, when somebody said, and I sort of innocently said, that's a bloody stupid thing to say, and the teacher got a little bit uptight about that. But I'll tell you an interesting experience. When we moved to East Melbourne, at the end of 48, I went to see the headmaster at what was then Caulfield Tech at Snapart and Monash, in Dandenong Road, and took all my things, and he said, all right, we'll put you in years 8, which is grade 2, form 2. And I said, well, for my age, I really should be in form 3. And the then headmaster, I well remember him, Mr. Buchanan, he's one of the very old school, and he didn't like this idea. But anyway, in the end, he said, all right, I'll put you in year 3, it's year 9, isn't it? I'm sort of converting. But, I'll put you there for 6 weeks, but if you don't firm up, you'll go back to one below. And don't think I won't be watching you. Well, I stayed there. Initially, the language I learned very quickly, but I had problem with the written work. But even obviously that sort of solved itself. And the next time I went back to school was many, many years later. I did an off-course BA at Deakin, and then having been bitten by the bug, I did an MA at Monash, sort of semi-off campus. So, no, look, I can't say I had any sort of problems at school. It's sort of, I mean, in the primary schools here, I was a bit of an oddity because this is before the great wave of migrants came. And so in many ways, I was a bit of an oddity that, sort of drew attention. No, I can't say I had any negative experiences.
That's great.
Well, for most kids know how to write because they live on 40 character sort of messages. Look, I think the other thing is becoming obsolete, that in many ways I think community seems to be drifting apart. Where, I mean, you take, going back, sort of back to the 40, even 50s, I mean, nobody locked their doors. People can come in and be, in fact, a friend of mine wrote her family history, and it's called No Locked Doors. She grew up in Shepparton, and people just came in and took something out for it. I think that is the thing where these days, that in many ways, very few people have any contact with the neighbours, except when they have disputes about the fence or something. I think that is the difference, because there's so many other distractions. Well, I'll give you a sort of probably not relevant example. Some years ago when we were in Germany, we were going on a train and the place was crowded. So the woman put her 9-year-old kid in one carriage, there was the only seat, and she was in another carriage. And he had his little electronic thing, and he couldn't have cared less about the mother. She said, look, if there's any problem, just, I'm not going to case it. I think that is sort of, I know it's a sort of fun, but I think it's a sort of almost a syndrome of how kids these days, I mean, only the other day we're having lunch in a restaurant, there's a kid about 3 or 4, and all he did was looking at his playing little games. I mean, no contact with his siblings, no contact with the parents. I think that really is the sort of thing that somehow the sense of community. In fact, we're only talking about this with some friends a few months ago. We were having lunch. That these days, I'm not saying all, but parents, here's $20, go and amuse yourself. I mean, when we were young, these things weren't there. We had to make our own fun. I think that is the basic difference. That somehow, sort of lost that sense of putting things together. Used to go down to the dairy with a little can, get milk. And you used to go to the grocery shop. They used to cut up the butter, wrap it in paper. They used to get the biscuits out of the tins on the shelves. Look, I think it's become, I mean, you take, there is no such thing as the corner grocer anymore, where, basically, the sort of family-run business, and the grocer knew exactly what you were going to ask for. I think it's sort of unpersonalized. I mean, you walk in the supermarket, and it's sort of, I mean, it's all very nice. It's all there, but the choices are wider. But somehow it's not that. Well, this is probably a bad example, but a couple of months ago I was in the supermarket, and there's an old lady at the checkout, and the girl behind the checkout said, have a nice day. And the lady said, what did you say? She said, you're deaf or something? I mean, that's sort of totally impersonal thing. I mean, the family grocer almost knew the family. I mean, I'm not saying this is good or bad, but I think the whole concept of how people interact has totally changed. Well, probably would ask me a question I couldn't answer. How would you cope with all these changes if you were alive or here today? I mean, would you adjust, or would you just say, well, look, this is why a lot of, I mean, you take now, that's the other side too, that the family doctor more or less disappeared. I mean, all right, you've got your doctor at the clinic, but basically, this week the doctor needs to see somebody else. I mean, in the old days, the family doctor, he knew the family, he knew all their problems, and you can confide in them what had problems. So look, I think, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I think that's this sort of personal touch amongst people, particularly deal with often, I think has sort of disappeared. Three tram tickets? Look, I mean, things like, this is probably totally ridiculous, but phone books. I mean, these days, I don't know whether they actually still issue them, but it's all online, which is great. But what about the people who are sort of not connected online? And that, a lot of these things and how sort of people are connected with authorities, with all sorts of day-to-day things they have to do. And look, I mean, probably I'm regressing here, but I think it's, you don't have that feeling with connection with anybody. I mean, you got your friends, you got your local shop, but it's, the whole world has changed. That once upon a time, it's not a fairy tale, you could actually go down the street. I mean, a classic example is the way banks operate. That, I mean, a lot of the banks, the branches are closed. They really don't want you to come in. They charge you $2 to take your own money out. I think that is the big thing also the other thing is that the bank manager today basically is just a servant of the bank. I mean, way back, the bank manager, he was a sort of, personal business contact. I think these are all the changes that have taken place. And the other thing is, of course, travel has become much more, well, not the last 18 months, and also how the way you can communicate. I mean, these days, you can communicate with your friends and contacts all over the world instantly. Way back, this was a drawn-out process. I don't know whether you remember aerograms. Well, aerograms are sort of a shortened type of letter. Mail. I mean, this business of, it's not vital because all of course bring bills these days, but every third day you get mail. I remember way back, where there used to be postal deliveries twice a day, Saturdays, and the poster used to blow the whistle. I mean, I don't think it's sort of world changing, but that's a sort of different scenario. And you used to give the poster and the dustman used to give them Christmas presents, but this whole thing's, I'm not saying this is bad or good, but it's just a totally different environment. I'll give you a little example, it's probably ridiculous. Last year my wife had a problem with a mobile phone, and our grandson came, and Stephen's he's 26 now, so it would have been 24, and 2 minutes all fixed. And I said to Stephen, and Stephen's, he's got a BA and he's pretty cluey. I said, well, this is certainly different from the days we used to do things on a typewriter. And he looked at me and said, what's a typewriter, Pa? I mean, so it's that sort of background, that how things that today's generation doesn't really understand. In fact, there was a crossword clue today, a manual way of writing thing, a manual instrument of writing. Well, it's a typewriter. No, but look, in many ways, sure, we've progressed. Medicine sort of come up with better cures for things. Communication is better when it doesn't drop out. But somehow the world is different. And yeah, some people, I think I'm reasonably adaptable, but some people are not. They just can't cope with all this. When you look at sort of history timelines, we've gone, particularly technology, further in the last 100 years than we have in the last 3,000 years. Of course, we don't know what external forces will there be war with China? Will there be, what's happening will there be another pandemic? In fact, as I mentioned, I'm a voluntary guide at the Shrine. We get a lot of school groups. And I remember last year, I think it was probably year 6, this kid, we were showing him around, and he said, well, when will World War III start? I said, hopefully never. But the world's changing so fast. It's very hard to see, where we're going to be. There'll be electric cars, no doubt. Not in Victoria because we're not going to pay 2.5 cents a kilometre. But look, when you look at the changes over the last 100 and 150 years, it's very, very hard to predict where will we be. Maybe we'll all live on Mars, who knows? Probably the urge to find new ways of doing things. I think that's probably because when you go back in history, how it sort of evolved, from the cavemen sitting around bushfires. Mind you, when you look at the news, what's happening in India, all these cremations in the market square. Look, I think, basically, humans will still be humans with their foibles and their good points. I think that probably will not change, because that is sort of, and I think also in many ways will change, but I think that the family unit. We've now what we call the nuclear family unit, where when you sort of way back, the whole family lived forever in the same house. And if you look at although that's probably changing too, but the family concept, where there's sort of the hierarchy, where the elders are always the respected, that will probably modify. But look, it's very hard to predict. Nostradamus predicted that the world will end close to the year 2000. Well, it didn't. And all those skeptics who stocked up big because the world's going to stop when the 2000 with the 2 figure. In fact, I've got some friends who are a little bit deluded, and I'm convinced they've still got stuff in their storeroom that they ordered for when the world is going to stop. You would think, look, this is one of the great failings of the human race. We don't learn from history. When World War I came, was the Great War to end all wars. Well, the fact was, after 1918, there was only something like 3 or 4 years when there was no conflict anywhere in the world. But when you look what's happening, and I think there are going to be more problems in Afghanistan now that the Americans and the troops have pulled out. Look, I'm not going to go into the environment thing. That's sort of. I think really that, even internally, you take particularly America. What happened in America in the political scene, and I don't think it will ever settle down. That, in fact, my late uncle, who lived most of his life in France, he put out a book in the 1950s. He advocated that they should do away with politicians and have technocrats, run government, because they then just focus on realities. It's quite fascinating that then in the 1950s, this would have been a totally ridiculous concept. But look, maybe as technology, maybe that will become something of a goal. Whether it's going to be good or bad, that's another story. The short answer is no. I mean, there'll be sort of areas will work well, but there will always be. I mean, you take what's going on at the moment with the rise of the right wing. Some of these, without, I know the police commissioner said there are no youth gangs, but you've got to pick up the paper or look at television. Look, I don't think that they haven't had for, 40,000 years. I mean, I don't think they'll change that much. Well, I think, look, we're moving. You take cannabis to start with. I mean, a lot of things will change. Some things obviously will stay, but look, it's very hard to predict how the legal system will adapt and change. Has Collingwood won another flag? Well, I'll tell you one and that's still with me. I can still feel that sort of aura today. In 15th of March 1939, when the Germans marched into Prague in the Czech Republic, and all the military machinery went down the street, tanks, and that probably will stay with me, as you could feel the aura of evil, of things that were going to happen later on. That probably is probably the one that really sticks with me. I would probably have tried to go to uni early in life, but then again, when you bring up family, we're working, probably not. But that probably would have been, I might have sort of done more things in that direction. But look, it's hypothetical. You can't turn the clock back. Adjusting to a totally alien environment, which initially is very daunting, but once you get into it, you can see the benefits. You broaden your view on life, you broaden your outlook of the things that you didn't think you could do, that you discovered that you can do. Probably that I've got the sort of ability to cope with change, that I can adapt without great trauma. Changing occupations, changing professions, and seeking out new places, doing new things. That probably, I think, sums up. I think the hardest lesson I ever learned is probably when you're on the path to want to achieve something, that you give up halfway. Just say, this is too hard. I think that's something that you should really work your way through, the rough spots, not saying, well, no, too hard, I'll give it away. I think that is probably a lesson that sort of stands very well in life. Probably when our first child was born. I mean, here's a whole new world. Probably that your physical health deteriorates to the point when you can no longer be independent. I think that really is that you can't do things that you want to do. Sure, you slow down, but you can still do the things you want to do. I would say that our children and grandchildren, particularly grandchildren, will find themselves in the world that we did, of trauma, uncertainty. I think that is probably one of the major things that concerns me, that they don't go through the things that we did when we sort of at that stage. When I was sort of an electrical apprentice, we're doing a job at Ellen's, the sweet people in South Melbourne. The ladder slipped, and I finished up with one leg in a vat of liquid butterscotch. At the same time, I also had my hand behind the board, and I got a bit of I think that's why I slipped. I got a bit of a shock. I still had a scar somewhere from the burn, but that was probably one of the most dangerous things I've been involved in. Yes and no. Now this one, look, I don't believe God is a little bearded old man who sits up there in the book and writes all your sins in the book. But I think there is an outer force somewhere that things. There must be something behind why things sort of happen. As I said, it's a sort of I don't necessarily believe in, as I said, in the sort of concept that he watches everything. There's a man with a beard writing. But look, I think there is an external force somewhere. But yeah, sort of things I can't define. I'm not. Look, it's one of those areas that you really can't put your finger on. But as I said, the basic thing, I don't believe, as I said, there's someone up there who writes all your good and bad deeds in a book. I mean, that I think is sort of. Look, I really think there was a way back, so about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, a Jewish prophet Hillel. And Hillel said, yeah, if you're only for yourself, not for others, yeah, who are you? I think that is probably, look, basically religion is really about a moral and ethical code. It's not necessarily, you got to there or there if you don't go to church on Sunday. But look, it's one of those nebulous concepts. So perhaps, as I said, I believe there is some force that directs us, but not sort of, what most people don't share is that there is it's a wild world, and there's, different cultures, different beliefs. We're not all on the one level. And of course, prejudice is a human sort of condition. But I think we need to work consciously to sort of sidestep from prejudice to see other people's point of view. And I think most people don't share that sort of universal. I mean, I'm not saying I do totally, but that the concept of in India, well, there's a lot of them there. I think that sort of thinking is still around, and I don't know. Look, so things change but basically, I think most people are fairly sort of localized, if you like, that they don't really care what goes on the other side of the world. That is probably not a good answer, but that's sort of. Oh, I'm going to hear trouble now. Look, I think the sort of concept of a nationalistic sort of thinking now, and I won't go into the climate change, but I think a lot of these things, I mean, I'm probably on dangerous ground here, but you take some of these demonstrations that most of them, and that sort of get violent, but most of the people who go to these things go there because of genuine belief that things are, but then you get some of these outside agitators who use these occasions to stir up. That's why you get all these riots. And I mean, you take what happened in Washington on the 6th of January. That, all right, rightly or wrongly, many people felt the election was rigged, and they went to protest. Now, obviously, there were some agitators which led to the storming of the House of Reps and the Senate. A lot of these sort of confrontations you see, Black Lives Matter, I'm not saying they don't, but once again, some of the motivation of the masses go there are quite genuine, that they want show change. But you get these outside groups that get involved in this and really cause, I think this is one of the very great problems, not just, I mean, Australia in many ways, we're not that badly off, but you look overseas, look what's happened in Paris at the moment. There's huge strikes, demonstrations in Germany, because there's this tension. And when things like now, things sort of economically are bad, that really sort of brings people the frustration to the fore, which is then fomented by self-interested groups that use these occasions for their own purpose. I think this is one of the big problems that I don't know if there's an answer to it. The silly answer is follow Essendon. No, look, I think that really I think they don't understand. So it's that difference when you've got, it's probably not as pronounced in Australia, but the south of the Yarra, north of the Yarra. But I think most people don't understand how the other half lives. That the ones sort of sit on huge properties and drive, whatever. They don't really understand people who struggle, who sort of every week they can't pay either it's food or the electricity bill or sending kids on school outings. I think that is the sort of the division, and it's always been there, and I really can't see it's going to change, because there's a mindset people that look, that's a sort of their favourite brand of jam's not available on the supermarket shelf, and they don't really understand how the other half lives, if you like. People, every day is a struggle. Probably they view certain sort of developments in the world. I think once again you've got the sort of the European mindset, who didn't quite sort of share opinions or had no knowledge of, say, people in Asia, in Africa. I think that is probably. I think also time and communication has an impact on that. That you learn much more about other places that way back then you really didn't, wasn't really available, the information. That's probably more open-minded to the rest of the world. I mean, not of bias, because the information wasn't there. I mean, today, exactly within what goes on anywhere in the world. So 50, 60 years ago, you relied on the newspaper that might report this a month, a week later. I think that's probably, it's not so much a personal thing. I think it's evolution of the global scene. Well, I think the best thing is that you get a much wider experience of life. The worst thing is probably your physical and mental deterioration. That the fear, and with that goes the fear that you'll become reliant on other people. I mean, whether they're willing or not, it's just that fear that, I mean, you take, the onset, and I've got a lot of our friends where you get Alzheimer's, where you don't really know what's going on, and you're relying on little things for someone else to do for you that you've done all your life. I think that is probably one of the, I think everybody shares that fear, that your physical sort of state will not allow you to do certain things, go certain places, and your mental sort of deterioration. That's actually interesting about, as a side thing, that I think Alzheimer's is far worse on those around the person than the person himself, because they don't really know that where they are. I think this is one, and that always this talk of people going into on the old age home, that sort of thing. Quite frankly, that to me would not. I mean, when you know what's going to happen. That's something I could really not cope with. Look, I've always been very much sort of to the left. I mean, I'm not sort of ultra red tomato left, but it's always sort of a social, we're social justice. Probably more in the humanities. I mean, this is where the big cry is now. The government's cutting down arts funding and all that. I think you really need a broader spectrum of the world. And I know now there's this big kerfuffle about consent and all this thing. And I definitely think that what just happened down at I think Parkland, the social youth worker from Kingston Council, who made the boys stand up and say sorry because they're white and Christian and male. I mean, that to me, I think what really should be taught is more acceptance of other cultures, of other ways of doing things. The sort of, and I think we've gone a fair way with the LGB thing and that. But I think there's too much emphasis now on science-based stuff rather than humanities, because it sounds very nice, but it's very narrow. I mean, humanities spans a much wider sort of aspect of things. The legal thing, I'll probably go over the speed limit or something. I haven't stolen anything, I haven't murdered anybody. The obvious answer would be blue and white for Geelong, but that's, look, probably something with bright sunshine and flowers. So just a sort of a nature feeling. Yes, there's a place called Theresienstadt, which was in the Czech Republic. Now, Theresienstadt was a military fortress that was started in the 1700s by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was named after the emperor's mother, Maria Theresa. But Theresienstadt basically was a sort of transit camp. It was not a destruction camp, and basically it was established initially in 1941 from Jews from Czechoslovakia. Then German war veterans from First World War came there, and later on some Hungarian Jews came, and basically the concept was that it was sort of a transit camp before they deported them, people to the east and like Auschwitz, place like that. Now, during the 4 years, something like 140,000 people went through the place, and I mean, what the Germans tried to do was sort of a elite camp. In fact, they made a documentary film, the town that Hitler gave to the Jews, and then sort of made a documentary with all nonsense. They had a Red Cross delegation came in 1994 inspect, how well the Jews were treated by and in many ways it was sort of self-administered by a Jewish town councilman. They're totally under the command of the SS. So, but it's sort of in many ways not like some of the camps in the East, but it was still insufficient food, insufficient medicine. Some 30,000 people died of natural causes there, and it was when it was liberated at the end of in early 1945 when the Soviet army advanced and all the camps in the East were liquidated. They brought something like 3,000 people back to Theresienstadt. Now, there were things going on. They were building all sorts of weird structures, and if the war had lasted long, that probably would have liquidated everything. But then, time overtook them. So it was sort of it wasn't as sort of severe as Auschwitz, all those places, but it's still, lack of food, lack of sanitations. You can imagine that in a place that normally, in normal times, the town had about a population of 3,500. When you had something like 45 to 50,000 people crammed into at one time, you can sort of visualize some of the conditions. There's sort of 3-tier bunks in large rooms, like people in the attic. So that basically was, Theresienstadt. And in many ways, it was probably a milder form of what went on in the rest of Europe. Really, you didn't know, because first of all, the train at that stage only went to a place about 4 kilometers from Theresienstadt, and you walked the last 4 kilometers. In 1943, they extended the railway line, but you didn't really understand. I mean, once again, I was 8, so your impression is slightly different. But obviously, it was a sort of strange place, had a lot of people, armed guards all around, and you're allocated to a particular place. So it was confusing in many ways. But once again, when you're an adult, you've got a point of reference what normal life was. When you're a kid, you don't really have that sort of reference point. So you just adopt things day by day. It's not normal life, but you acclimatise up to a point. There were two sets. There was the SS, of course, but the day-to-day administration was by the Czech field police, and by and large they're pretty decent. But then again, the SS, they did also. In fact, there's one guy there. I think he was of Polish extraction. He's a corporal. He used to drive 3-ton trucks, and he had a particular hobby, running people down. That was his thing. So it varies. Different commanders had different sort of ways of doing things. So once again, you sort of look. The best thing you did was sort of keep your head down, keep out of the way. When you saw someone in uniform, you sort of went round the corner. Sort of worked somewhere. But look, the thing was, and this is one of the thing that's often been come up, sort of, in historians. You probably don't know whether you've heard about the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. Well, there's always the question, why didn't this happen in other places? Well, I think, and look, this is a more theory, that people believed, well, this will be over soon. And really, they didn't really want to sort of take that extra step for him in danger. At the end of the day, it didn't matter, because the end result for most people, we all know. But that probably, and also, particularly amongst a very large contingent of interiors that were basically, from Germany, and a lot of them were First World veterans. And they had that sort of inbuilt thing that you don't revolt against authority. This is the sort of, that's been there for centuries. And that is, but I think basically it was, well, look, we'll keep our head down, it'll be over very soon. Well, obviously it wasn't, but I think that is probably the underlying things why they weren't. Not really. Once again, when you're that age, you sort of, you're not really into these escape plan. Besides, where would you have gone? The surrounding countryside probably wasn't. The Czechs were quite good, but then again, the place was occupied. Where else would you go? You had no documents. You had no, no sort of money. It probably, maybe some of the adults had these ideas, but no. I certainly didn't, because it just didn't occur. Well, there probably were, because there was artists, there was writers, there's cultural groups formed themselves. There was no schooling. Probably people who worked in certain areas had a connection. Once again, I think you just live day by day. As I said, kids, and in fact, when I did the one with the Spielberg Foundation, one with the Holocaust Center, the interviewer said, how did you feel about that? I said, look, this is a nonsense question, because when you're a child, you don't have that point of reference of what is normal life. So, in fact, we had argument's probably wrong, but got the point, so look, let's move on this. We're not going to agree on this. Like all human sort of groups, some were, others, me first, never mind about the rest. Look, and I think particularly under unusual circumstances, this becomes far more focused. That, you get people who are, look after people, you get other people who say, me, never mind about the rest. So, and that probably, particularly with sort of outside strains, this becomes far more relevant, pronounced. Sure, there's quite a few sadistic, but then again, a lot of them, In fact, there's a case just now in Germany where they've charged a 97-year-old man who was a guard at Ravensbrück. I mean, he was an 18-year-old conscript. Now, look, I'm not defending him, but what I'm saying is, a lot of them were conscripts, and I mean, I always ask myself, if I had been on the other side, how would I have acted? Would I have said, look, I'm not doing this, or would I have said, well, Look, it's a very difficult question, particularly in hindsight, because, I mean, you take people who are conscripted to the army. Now, killing enemies, was that a war crime, or was that part of what they were there for? Look, it's a question that really very, very hard to quantify. I mean, there's so many. I mean, what I would say, and this is the point, I had an interesting case when I was in Germany, talking to schools. After we finished, one lad came up to me, and he said, "Look, my grandfather was a guard at Auschwitz. I mean, how would you view me?" And I said, "Look, your generation, it wasn't you. So I mean, how can you sort of put that in context? So how can you say to the people who are the guards? I mean, I'm not defending them, but I mean they're part of the system, and the system was rotten. And did they follow orders? Because if they hadn't, they would have been put up against the wall and shot. Did they do it out of sort of personal satisfaction, doing things like that? Look, I don't think you actually put a logical answer to that question. You had no idea. You had no idea. I mean, I'll tell you, in 1944, when the Americans started daylight bombing of Germany, and we're in the flight path, when you saw, and usually they came over during the day, you had some feeling, look, something sort of, something's happening. Something will, there must be a time when all this will end. But, it was pure guesses. I'll tell you some of the things this would generate. There was a couple of adventurous fellows who spread a rumour. They wanted to test the Bush telegraph. That I think the original message was that 20 tanks were outside Prague. Within an hour, the story was that an American army had invaded Prague. They will be here next day. So that's a sort of mass psychology exercise. But you really don't know what, because very little outside sort of news filtered in. Mm-hmm. And some of that did, particularly the atrocities, either the sort of camp of Jewish authorities didn't know about it, or that if they did, they didn't want to spread it, not cause extra panic. So once again, it's a sort of fluid situation in these things. I mean, which is the fact, which is sort of hopeful fantasy. Look, in many ways, life wasn't normal. Life went on. You sort of had your group of friends. You did things. So, but I think the positive memory was that you're still here. I think that really is that life sort of started again once the war was over. Admittedly, it was in different phases, sort of changing countries, changing cultures. But I think that is the positive memory. Oh, look, there's always funny things happen because, there's the sort of thing. Well, I don't know if it was actually funny, but for preparing for the Red Cross visit, they put up, they opened up cafes, they opened up, shops, and they sort of built sort of great things and public entertainments. It was all fake. In fact, I think I mentioned this before, back in the days of the Russian Tsar, when the Tsar travelled to the provinces, there was sort of one court official who went ahead and beautified the place and all that and put up facades, one Potemkin. And when all this was happening in Terezin, some wit sort of brought out this little ditty saying, if Potemkin knew what was going on in Terezin, he would turn his grave because he's been far surpassed in his efforts. Oh, look, there's always sort of fun things, there was also, there's always, this is what I run a course in family history at U3A, what I tell students, that no matter how dark the history is, there's always light, there's always something, and you've got to put that into light and shade. Not really, because were a number of, in fact, Melbourne outside Israel is the largest, or was, because a lot of them are gone now, the largest Holocaust survivor community in the world. And there's about 5 or 6 people here that were in Terezin with us. A lot of them obviously are now gone to the big camp in the sky. So yeah, there's quite a few. Well, you did in your circles. There was a number of friends. There was, and when we sort of had to go to work in the tailor shop, there was a group of us who sort of had a bit of connection with each other.
What did you do in the tailor shop?
We mended uniform that came back from the Eastern Front, and this sort of might be a very perverse sort of feeling, but in many ways, whenever we saw some bullet holes, it was sort of, oh, good, there's one less of them. But actually, my I made shoulder pads. That was my speciality. Oh, look, you probably did have good days, It's probably, when in summer when the weather was good, you sort of sit outside somewhere. But once again, it's sort of like anything else in life, probably more sort of focused on things. But you've got good days, get bad days when things sort of happen. But look, in many ways, it was a normal life in the most abnormal sort of setting. You got up in the morning, you did this, you did that. So in some ways, you had a routine. Once again, it's that age distinction. When you're a kid with no background reference points, it's a totally different scenario than when you're an adult and you remember normal life. A couple of people, most of the others have sort of died. In fact, a friend of mine, I saw him yesterday, there's about half a dozen people we still have fairly close contact with. Well, I think it's sort of a great dawning in your life that it's all over and life will return to some sort of normal. Mind you, then of course we had this transition we knew that we were going to go to Australia, but it took about almost 2 years while all the paperwork was done, and also transport was, shipping. That stage, most countries used their shipping to repatriate their armed forces. But you knew that another transition would happen. But then again, normal life resumed. You went to school, you did things. So once again, it's sort of a half and half situation. I don't think, not really, because we've never sort of strictly ultra-Orthodox. And it's actually very interesting that some of the ultra-Orthodox then married German Aryan women, non-Jewish women, and they're sort of almost saying, well, there can't be a God, how could God permit this happening? But to us, really, it didn't really, we're traditional. We sort of observe certain things. It's more of a cultural sort of a background with us. So I don't think it really did. Well, the ones who took part, yes, but then again, as I said, I've been to Germany 6 or 7 times in the last 30 odd years, and I go and talk to groups, to schools about things, and look, you can't, you've got to understand you're into the 3rd generation now, and you really cannot sort of blame the sons of the sins of the fathers. And quite a few people in Germany now sort of have that same, they want to sort of make up and but once again you now got the rise of the the right wing, and some of these historians say never happened. So yes, I do feel animosity towards that generation. But as I said, one day we may forgive, we must never forget, because I think that is and this is why I'm involved with organisation Encourage to Care. We go and talk to schools about prejudice, and sort of Holocaust almost the wallpaper, the background. And that really is, what's happening in Shepparton at the moment, there's all sorts of bullying, but I think there's a lot of racism behind it. And we've had a number of exhibitions over the years in Shepparton. And I think it's so important to tell the future generation, what happened. Because I think it was Plato, that those who don't recall history will be forced to relive it. I think that is really the important thing. And that's why, so whenever I have a chance to go to Germany, I speak to schools, I speak to groups, and that, it's interesting. And in fact, there's an article in the paper somewhere the other day that now in Germany, the governments are still putting up monuments and blah, blah, blah. But the current generation are more saying, look, let's put a line and let's move on, let's not talk about all this. I think that's a sort of syndrome. But the thing is that I think it's important to keep the story, to pass it on, because of what happened. And that's the other thing I've experienced when I've sort of spoken over there, that kids come up to me and they actually is a school subject, the Holocaust, but they come up and say, look, we learn about this, but actually to talk to someone who was there, it's a whole different, makes the thing come alive. I think that really is so it's no good saying, look, it's been, let's forget it. I think it's important, not because of, we want to tell the story, but for the steps to the future. Initially it was a bit strange because I hadn't really been to school, and also we had this sort of thing, we knew we were going to leave, so sort of, when is it going to happen, what's the plan? So no, look, I'll justify it once again that when you're a kid it's much easier to adjust to things, because you look at things. Well, basically, we're given a flat, we're given things, and my father started a small business. So, in many ways it became a reasonably regulated life. Yeah, look, the General Army basically were conscripts. The SS were sort of hand-picked, sadists, most of them. In fact, I had a very interesting discussion a couple of times when I was in Germany with the then Lord Mayor of Stuttgart, who was Irving Rommel's son, the Desert Fox. And he was saying that Rommel, now Irving, the Field Marshal, had very great regard for the Australian troops, despite that they were on the other side. So look, the army, in many ways, most of the army were conscripts. And but the SS were hand-picked sadists. there's no, I understand, I've read some transcript, that one of the questions was, when you volunteered for the SS, one of the questions was, can you carry out sadistic acts? That was one of the basic interview questions when you applied. But also you must understand that for generations these people have been sort of inoculated with the concept that all these other people are not really humans, they're subhumans, and that really fostered the way they carried on. the Aryan race up there and all the subhumans over there. So psychologists can probably give you a far better answer than I can. Well, my two grandparents on my mother's side, my grandmother on my father's side, my father's my father's sister, and a few other sort of outer family, but they're the immediate inner family. Probably the fact that you limit your sort of behind barbed wire, you're limited, that you couldn't really, do what you wanted to go, where you wanted to go. You didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Well, there was one instance where they decided in 1943 they're going to have a census of the camp. There were 30,000 people there. We all got marched out to a sort of outside the camp. There's like a huge hollow, sort of a meadow type of thing with hills around it. And from early in the morning till late at night, they kept counting and recounting. And a number of people sort of dropped dead, no food, no water. And then as it got dark, there was spotlights on the surrounding hill and machine guns. So that probably was, you didn't really know what was going to happen to you because, sort of from minute to minute. And then after dark, everyone got marched back in the camp. So I still to this day don't know, was this a sort of a bureaucratic exercise that the Germans loved numbers, or was there something more sadistic behind it? It's something I've never really discovered. That probably was a time when you're out there in the open and sort of, that I think probably would rate high on the scale of things. Now this probably sounds a little bit silly, that it gave you a sense of belonging, that you knew that you were ostracized, but you knew you're part of a group that shared the same fate. I don't even answer that because once again, the child syndrome comes in. Children are not really expected to make any decisions. Possibly if I had been an adult, the decision would have been to leave Europe. That wasn't my part, but see, this is one of the, in a broader picture, one of the tragedy that befell German Jews. That when it all started, back in 1933, they said, this is not going to last, this is rubbish, it'll go away. And by the time they realized it's not going to change, go away, most countries wouldn't sort of accept anybody. I think that was, if I had been an adult then, maybe I would have decided, said, look, let's get out of Europe, this is not the place. But look, hypothetical. Well, never again. Never let it happen again. Whether we have control over that, but that really is, the catch cry of this. And this is one of the things without, I'm probably straying into sort of global politics now, that this is one of the sort of rationale of the state of Israel. That there is a place, if things happen, where Jews can go. But look, I know there's another thing this morning about they've now declared the racist, but that's a totally different. But I think that probably is the bottom basic rule: never let it happen again. I think that really is, the bottom line. I can't answer that. I really cannot answer that. Education of everybody, perhaps, these things should never happen again, but I really cannot give you, I'd be Socrates if I knew the answer to that. There's something I read the other day, I think out of a conference in America, that the gas chambers weren't the start of the Holocaust. The start of the Holocaust was way back, sort of decade or even century ago, where this prejudice against certain groups sort of was allowed to arise in communities. Be it sort of prejudice against the the African Americans in America, be it against the Hutus, the Tutsis in Africa. I think that really is it's the early sort of prejudices that arise without being sort of this. I probably shouldn't say this off the record, but in Europe, a lot of this started back 2,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago. The way, particularly in country place of the Catholic Church, how they sort of propagated this, the Jews killed Jesus. I think that, and they propagated this, and that sort of eventually, solidified this prejudice and sort of went on to other things. I think it's frightening. I mean, we've seen it before. We've saying, "Well, look, they're a fringe group," but fringe group have a, particularly when there's sort of economic problems, world problems, people tend to sort of gravitate towards these things because they're unhappy with what their own position, their situation, unhappy what the government is sort of saying and imposing or not imposing. I think this is why it's so important to keep telling the story. That to say, "Oh well, look, they're just a fringe group, nobody take," well, that's not. That's how it all started back in Europe, back in the 20s. Look, I think basically people are probably tend to be good rather than evil, but I think there's certain triggers that even reasonable people, for all sorts of unknown reasons, tend to move towards the dark side. On what logic do you base your prejudices? I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, this wasn't in a bad way, but I remember when I was an apprentice, I was on one of the building sites where, I don't know, I was sitting around having tea at lunchtime, and a fellow said, "Oh, look, the Jews are all bad." I said, "Well, have you ever met one?" He said, No, you're probably the first one I've met. And it's sort of this concept that people get in their minds that, the business, all Jews are rich and all Jews, I mean, it's, once again, it's ignorance that starts all these things. That people pick up things, they don't really understand the background of it. So I think, once again, the more you can converse with lots of people and sort of tell the story, tell your point of view, see their point of view, and perhaps say, "Look, I think you haven't quite got the facts." I think that's what it's all about. It's communications between people and spreading knowledge. I've always sort of taken life as it comes. Sure, you've got certain hang-ups about this, but you look forward to each new day. You make mistakes, so, well, I hope I don't make the mistake again. I think really, if you, the woman I met in Stuttgart, she also was a child in Stuttgart who went to Theresienstadt. And we worked out when we were there on a couple of occasions, we're the only two kids, Jewish kids from Stuttgart, who survived Theresienstadt. But Inge, I mean, I feel sorry for her. She travels and lectures all over the world, but that's her life. She doesn't look forward. She's never married, she hasn't got any kids, and for her, the past is her life. And that, to me, is totally counterproductive. I mean, sure, you remember the past, but you move on. There's the future out there. And I think that's different, but basically, it's a stark contrast between her and me. That's her life, talking about the past and doing this and that. To me, all right, the past, you really, but you move forward. There's things out there. Oh, I think I've got reasonable health. I've got a healthy family, a close-knit family. I've achieved a few things, contributed a few things in life, and I've done something. Well, look, hopefully, when I've moved on, I've left something behind that's positive for something. I mean, whether it is or not, that's for others to judge. It's not for me to. I have a secret hunch. It's going to be when I'm 89. I'll explain that. It's weird. A few years ago, it must be about 35, nearly 40 years ago. I was in Hong Kong, on a trade mission. And Sunday there was nothing to do. And next to our hotel there's a Chinese cultural centre. So I wandered in there, and the fellow who read palms. I mean, I don't believe in this rubbish, but they're for $3. But the fascinating thing was he was blind, and he had a fellow assistant sort of asked him, and all he did, he felt my hand, and he wanted to know, we're from Australia, and then he told me my past, which is totally out of kilter and nothing to do with from Australia. That when you're young, you're sort of in a place where of lock up, and you had this and that, but which is absolutely. I mean, as I say, I don't believe in this sort of flamboyant nonsense, but this was so telling that he exactly told me, what had been in my previous life, which didn't fit in with Australian tourists. And he said, long life, you'll live till 89. So, so if I live past 89, I'm going to go back and ask my $3 back. Well, I'm still, as time goes, I still keep looking back to tell the story. I mean, you can't tell the story what's in front of you. Well, I think the title really, I think it's quite a good one. Looking back over my shoulder. I mean, as you go through life and you tell the story, you've got to look behind you. I think probably travel to other places, see how not only the scenery but other cultures live. Different foods, different. I think travel really gives you a far wider insight into the world around you. Probably that everyone can contribute something, be it small, be it large. In fact, once again, the Jewish sage of 2,500 years, Hillel, is a question. If you're only for yourself, what are you for? I think that really is it might be so very trite today's world, but it's something that, Well, I'll give you a little, also, there was a story back around about just before BC when the Romans occupied Palestine. A Roman soldier was walking, he saw this old man planting an olive tree. I mean, olive trees take 70 years to mature. And he said, "Old man, why are you planting this tree? You won't be there to the benefit." And the answer was, "Yes, but that's true, but I'm benefiting from the olives of the tree that my grandfather planted." I think that is really the sort of movement that you can't just live. You've got to consider what others have done. You sort of got to think ahead what this may do for future generations. I know this is all very philosophical, but using sort of lyrics of an old song, I think it came from Monty Python. Always look for the bright side of life. I think that really, look for the positives, not the negatives. I think that really is. I don't know if you ever read about the Jean-Paul Sartre, the philosopher. Well, there's a book he wrote, I'm trying to think of the title. Anyway, the opening paragraph is, "There are two men sitting in a dark dungeon. One only sees the dirt and the misery. The other one looks through the bars and sees the sunlight and looks to the future." I think that really is the message, that no matter what you're in, look on what could be the positive side, not the negative, because the negative is there, and if you let it overwhelm you, that's the end of the path. Well, perhaps, he was there, he never did anything evil, and he may have done some good. I mean, that's probably as close as I can get what I would imagine others will think of me. I think it's important for people to tell their stories. That's what I keep saying when I run the course, that it's not just family history people are writing of their own family. Well, they're opening a window into a time into a place, into a concept. I think that is really important, that you're sharing, you know, a vision that you have experienced that the others, obviously, because time is gone. But I think that is important because, I mean, why it might be talking on these family histories, but opening a window into a place, into a time, into events, into a community. I think that is really the bottom line. That everybody, well, I think I've mentioned this before, but there was a cop show in the 60s in America, The Naked City, that, I mean, the show itself is not an American cop show, but at the end of each episode there's a voiceover. There are 8 million stories in the Naked City. This has been one of them. I mean, that really is the very concept of all these sort of family and other histories, that everybody has a story. And many, sort of, they might be similar, but each one has a particular unique element to it. Oh, goodbye, keep well.